Welcome to De-Risky Business, the economic security podcast from the Center for New American Security in Washington, D.C. I'm your co-host, Emily Kilcrease.
And I'm your other co-host, Geoff Gertz. This week, we're doing a deep dive on national security investment screening, digging into how and why the Japanese company Nippon Steel's bid to acquire Pittsburgh-based U.S. Steel ended up in a security review. We're delighted to be joined by Evan Robinson-Johnson, a business reporter from the Pittsburgh Post Gazette, who's been closely following the story.
But before we get to the deal with Steel, we'll spend a few minutes reacting to the nominations of Scott Bessent as U.S. Treasury Secretary and Howard Lutnick for U.S. Commerce Secretary, including what these nominations mean for the U.S. Trade Representative.
As we'll discuss, the economic nominations haven't been as controversial as some of Trump's other picks, but there's still plenty to discuss on what they'll mean for U.S. economic security policy.
As always, you can reach us at deriskybusiness@cnas.org. This podcast is supported in part by Amazon and by general support to the CNAS Energy Economics and Security Program. So, Geoff, we've been eagerly awaiting news coming out of the presidential transition in terms of the economic agency appointments. Of course, we're all following some of the earlier roller coaster rides of the initial appointments to come out, but we now have finally some news to share and talk about in terms of the economic agency appointments. So, of course, in the last few days, we saw the nomination for the Secretary of Treasury of Scott Bessent, as well as the nomination of Howard Lutnick for the Department of Commerce and sort of USTR as well. We'll unpack kind of what that means and why that bit is a little bit confusing. But what do you think?
Yeah, so maybe let's start with Scott Bessent. So he's going to be heading up Treasury, assuming he gets confirmed. Pretty traditional pick here for the Treasury Department. So he's a billionaire hedge fund manager from the Key Square Group, previously worked at Soros doing some financial advising there. You know, again, I think overall, this pick is something that's going to be welcomed by the Wall Street wing of the Republican Party. And I think kind of relatively in that mainstream of, traditional kind of banking finance background.
Yeah, totally. I will say, I mean, some of the picks have been a little bit more controversial across the board. So when we got to these two picks of Bessent and Lutnick, it was kind of like, oh, okay, we've got a couple of bajillionaire mega donors from Wall Street. That tracks, actually. That's pretty consistent with what we've seen in other administrations.
Yeah, exactly. If you look at sort of, what he's talked about as his big priorities, sort of traditional things of cutting taxes, cutting regulations, looking at how do we address budget deficits and long-term indebtedness. So kind of pretty similar, you could imagine this coming out of any Republican presidential point, nothing kind of over the top, kind of Trumpy about him, as it were.
Yeah, so I think a key question is going to be, how does he handle the tariffs debate? This seemed to be a point of contention as the president's team was considering the nominations, whether the candidates were sufficiently committed to his tariff approach. And we saw some earlier statements from Bessent where he seemed to be a little bit more moderated on tariffs, candidly. And obviously coming into the Treasury Department with the sorts of objectives and priorities that he has, there's going to be a bit of a balancing act there. So what do you make of him in the tariffs debate?
Yeah, I think, we're all still trying to figure out where exactly he lands. But I do think, your point that he's got some signs of moderation seems correct. I think we've seen, certainly some of his earlier speeches seem to be kind of, not maybe 100% all in on the tariff agenda in the same way Trump is, although he's sort of, probably moved himself to be more aligned with Trump more recently. I do think one thing that's really interesting, he talks about tariffs often as about being for negotiating leverage. So he's sort of, this idea of, are the Trump tariffs a means to kind of better negotiate with our trading partners to get a better deal for the United States, or a long-term source of revenue? Again, certainly his earlier statements seem to suggest he was more on the negotiating side. He's sort of open to using tariffs to go out and negotiate new deals. So I think, again, that's something that will probably be welcomed by trade partners relative to the alternatives here.
Yeah, and we're unpacking just a little bit. I know we'll spend lots more time in future episodes talking about this, but there's a real tension between trying to use tariffs as a negotiating tactic and trying to use tariffs to raise revenue, right? I mean, if you're relying on tariff revenue, that really ties your hands when it comes to using them as a negotiating tactic. They're two very different approaches, and so we'll just have to watch and see how those kind of shake out.
Yeah, exactly. And certainly when you think about how the tariffs fit in with the broader kind of tax cut agenda, and if the tariffs are being used to make up some of that revenue, it may make it difficult to negotiate deals down the line.
So one thing I don't think we have a good sense of for him, besides kind of that balance with the taxes and the tariffs, is his views on China and really what his kind of what his posture would be on the whole national security toolkit that Treasury has. I mean, Treasury is a main economic agency, but they also have this huge responsibility in the national security space. So they oversee the CFIUS process, which we'll talk a lot more about later in this episode, but basically screening foreign investment into the United States to make sure there's no national security concerns with that investment. Treasury is also leading the process now to regulate outbound investments for the same sort of reason. So there's certain US investments in China that may present security risks. Treasury also has the whole sanctions portfolio, and it doesn't seem like we know a lot about his views on those national security issues or really the competition with China once you get outside kind of the tariff space.
Yeah, exactly. I haven't really seen anything on the, broader sort of national security toolkit. I think on the China front, there's been some reporting suggesting he'll probably be welcomed by the kind of China community. Again, relative to the alternatives here, he's probably a slightly more moderate voice compared to sort of Marco Rubio, some of the other China hawks. You can imagine maybe playing a somewhat similar role as Janet Yellen did in the Biden administration, being a kind of more moderating presence on the kind of China hawk spectrum here. But again, I think at the end of the day, sort of everyone in DC is a China hawk now. So even saying he's a moderating presence may be true, but let's not go over the top here.
Yeah, and actually, I wasn't even thinking Janet Yellen. I was actually thinking the model is Steve Mnuchin from the first Trump
Yeah.
administration, right? Where you had a Wall Street figure who was certainly comfortable being hawkish on China issues to a point, right? He was very involved in the China economic relationship and the tariffs and the trade war and all of that in the first Trump administration, but also was a bit of a moderating presence in that broader economic team. So I think the appointment of Bessent really, to me, seems like a Mnuchin kind of appointment.
Yeah, I agree with that.
All right, should we talk about Lutnick at Commerce?
Sure. So Howard Lutnick, Trump's appointee to run the Commerce Department. He's the CEO of Cantor Fitzgerald, a major investment bank. Also, a very big donor to the Trump campaign, was co-chair of the Trump transition team. Again, I think this is a pretty sort of, by the book appointee, kind of, similar to what you can imagine from other Republican appointees, again, coming from the kind of business realm. Broadly similar to a sort of Wilbur Ross, Pritzker Raimondo model of running commerce.
Yeah, I think that's right. And, Pritzker and Raimondo were Democratic appointees, right? But it's very traditional for the Commerce Department to have that leader with real business expertise. Commerce has been traditionally the voice of business and industry within the government, but also Commerce has changed a lot as an agency over the Biden administration, certainly over the first Trump administration, right, where they still have that role as being the voice of business and industry. And so a picnic like Lutnick makes a lot of sense. But then they're also right in the middle of all the tech competition issues. They've got the Bureau of Industry and Security, which oversees export controls, which is, really become a hugely important tool when we think about US China tech competition. What technologies are we letting go? What are we not letting go? They now have the new authorities like regulating imports of sensitive IT goods and services, the ICTS program. So there's just a lot more that Commerce does now.
Yeah, exactly. You could even say that Commerce, kind of the Secretary of Commerce, is as much a national security pick as an economic pick in many ways at the moment. And again, I don't think we have kind of real insight on where Lutnick's positions are on a lot of these things. Haven't seen him talk much about export controls, about sort of the various ICTS authorities that he will now have as secretary. So that's definitely something we'll be watching very closely to see where he goes. And then also, frankly, to see kind of where the other high-ranking appointees in the department end up. So certainly the undersecretary who will head up BIS, I think that's going to be a super important job. Really interesting to see, do they continue with the big push the Biden administration made on tech controls? I'm imagining so, but we don't really know. So we'll be kind of watching to see those names come out very closely.
Yeah, the deputy and undersecretary positions are always important, but I think you're right, especially for that portfolio. It's such a technical portfolio. It really requires a lot of detail and a lot of leadership to move that bureaucracy in the right way. And some people can do it and some people can't. So that will definitely be an important pick to watch, that undersecretary for industry and security at Commerce. Um, The other thing we do know about Lutnick is that he's got experience with China, right? He's had business interest in China. How do you think that will affect how he, takes on this portfolio?
We'll see. I think it is probably helpful to have somebody who has dealt with China from the private business side in this role. He'll kind of, understand a bit more where the sort of Chinese government is coming from on a lot of these things. Certainly outstanding questions. I think we sort of assume that these assets will end up in a blind trust or end up kind of divested from them, so they won't be a kind of conflict of interest that he'll have there. But I think, overall, having some China experience in this job is probably going to be quite helpful.
Yeah, and the other bit about Lutnick's biography that is quite interesting, he's the head of Cantor Fitzgerald. As folks may know, Cantor Fitzgerald took a huge, it was a huge tragedy during the 9/11 attacks. They had one of their main offices in the towers. They lost just hundreds of employees in the attacks, and he really seemed to have taken it personally to kind of rebuild the firm. And I wonder how that colors his view on the national security issues. That's obviously not a China issue, right? But like, as somebody who's really felt personally kind of the effects of attacks against U.S. national security, I do wonder how that how that influences thinking on some of these security issues.
Yeah, absolutely. And the kind of role of business in national security interests and sort of building back kind of American power from that. I could certainly see that happening a lot.
Yeah. So Lutnick, not an entirely surprising or controversial pick, it seems like, for commerce. But the thing that was interesting about that pick was that he doesn't seem to be in charge of only commerce, right? And I think we're all trying to figure out exactly what this means. But the nomination came out and said that Lutnick was going to be not just the nominee for the Secretary of Commerce, but that he would be overseeing the trade and tariff portfolio for the administration, including having direct authority over the U.S. Trade Representative's office. And the reason that is weird, of course, is that USTR is its own agency. It's part of the White House, and it has been led previously by a U.S. Trade Representative who is part of the cabinet and reports directly to the president. But now it seems like USTR is reporting to the Secretary of Commerce. So is this a demotion? Like, what does this mean?
Who knows? And I assume we're still going to get a separate appointee to be the head of USTR, but it's not clear. It's a little bit up in the air, frankly. Whoever that appointee is, I think, as you said, are they reporting now to the Commerce Secretary? That, again, would be a pretty big demotion from being a sort of cabinet level position that, every other agency is used to having kind of direct authority up to the president. So we'll see what this means. There's been kind of debates in the past about reorganizing the bureaucracy, and do we want to sort of bring in sort of USTR and Exim Bank and the Small Business Administration into a kind of bigger, stronger Commerce Department. That's something that the Obama administration actually threw out as an idea kind of 12 or so years ago. Maybe that is going to come back in the Trump administration. We'll see. But yeah, I think that's the real question now, sort of what does this mean for the future of USTR?
Yeah, and there's some logic to it, right? Like, one thing we've talked about in our own research and analysis is you've got all these economic tools really spread out. How do you coordinate them, and how do you make sure that they're all working hand in hand? So maybe that's what they're trying to do here. But there's just a lot of there's more questions than answers, and that one little phrase of that nomination is what does this all mean? And certainly, if they're formally trying to fold USTR under commerce, they would need congressional approval. So it's not something that can just be done by presidential statement. So definitely a space to watch in terms of how that all shakes out. And then also, like, will they nominate somebody to be USTR, and who might that be?
Yeah, and I think a lot of the early question was, is that a job that Robert Lighthizer is going to come back and retake again? Obviously, he was Trump's USTR in his first term. I think there was expectations that he was going to be playing a big role in Trump's economic policy in the second term. But at the moment, he looks a little bit like the odd man out. That sort of, we've got nominees now for both Treasury and Commerce. I think Lighthizer's name was sort of tossed around for both of those as possibilities at one point. Now there's still USTR, but again, I can't imagine Lighthizer wants to come back to USTR if it's in a sort of deputy has to report to Commerce kind of type position. So it's a real question of, where does Lighthizer go now? And then not just Lighthizer personally, but the more kind of aggressive pro-tariff kind of wing of the party that, again, seems very much where Trump himself is. At the moment, there's not real kind of center of power for that group in the nominees that have been named to date.
Yeah, I mean, I will say this really did surprise me. And like candidly, I over index on USTR and on Ambassador Lighthizer simply because that's where I worked and that's what I know. But I do think I think a bit of surprise is actually warranted here because it's not just that he was the USTR in the first Trump administration. He's been heavily involved in crafting the economic strategy, the tariff strategy. You know, he wrote a whole book about all of this. Like, I think he's really been an intellectual driving force behind a lot of the more aggressive approach using tariffs to achieve a wide range of objectives. And so, if that perspective isn't represented, and if he doesn't have a role, that actually is fairly surprising to me.
Yeah, agreed. And again, we're recording this Monday morning. Who knows what the future will bring? Maybe he'll be running NEC. There's sort of various other kind of
Yeah.
high level advisory roles he could play that may give him a sort of bit of a free hand to intervene across agencies. But at the moment, definitely sort of seeing where kind of both Lighthizer himself and the broader sort of intellectual leadership of the tariff movement ends in this administration will be really interesting to see.
Yeah, and maybe the last thing I'll say on this is it's a question of whether Trump is trying to build a team that has a consistency of viewpoint across all of the appointments, or whether he's trying to have a counterbalance. And what we saw in the first administration, where you had Steve Mnuchin of Treasury and Ambassador Lighthizer at USTR, it was counterbalance, right? And so there was they duked it out on a lot of these issues because you had two very different perspectives on how to approach, particularly the China relationship, right? And that's that they were two very kind of loyal, effective for what they were trying to achieve principles in the first Trump administration. So is the second Trump administration going to try to have that sort of counterbalance again, where you've got a diversity of viewpoints and then they have to kind of figure it out to tee things up for the president? Or, is there going to be more of a trying to have a consistent, coherent approach, across, not, I don't want to say coherent, maybe like a more unified approach, right? Because there's always value in a diversity of views. And so I think watching what happens with the USTR appointment and what happens with Lighthizer in particular is going to be a very strong signal about how they're building that team and how unified they want that team to be, or whether they do want to have those sort of intellectual battles like they had in the first administration.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think, so far with Bessent and Lutnick, they kind of both look relatively similar to what you might see in any administration. And so we're still waiting to see kind of, where does that balancing, the counterbalance come from in this administration, which again, my assumption is that Trump will want that. It seems that's something he's sort of valued throughout his career. So we'll see sort of, where those countervailing voices may come from.
All right. Well, it won't be boring. That's for sure.
Certainly not.
All right. Well, stay tuned. More to come on this. So today on De-Risky Business, we'll be talking about the proposed acquisition by Nippon Steel, a Japanese company, of U.S. Steel. Now, economic security listeners and followers will know that this is a deal that has been in the news for quite some time. It got quite controversial in the context of the presidential campaign, and we are coming up to an important deadline in the government's review of the case. And so we thought it was a good time to dig into why the federal government has raised concerns about this case from a national security perspective, talk a bit about the ins and outs of the CFIUS process that's been reviewing this, and then think a little bit about what the path ahead is for this transaction.
Yeah, exactly. So, this all really kicked off back in December of 2023 when we got the announcement from Nippon Steel that it intended to acquire US Steel for $14.9 billion. So a pretty big transaction. But again, nothing kind of massively surprising there. What was notable, so in the press release that Nippon put out, it had a kind of standard sort of disclaimer language subject to regulatory approval. And we are now seeing what that looks like. So one of the approvals needed is from what's called the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, generally known by the acronym CFIUS or CFIUS. And really, we've seen this kind of CFIUS fight play out. Really, we've seen the CFIUS fight, start to play out and kind of spill out into the public in some surprising ways in recent months.
Yeah, maybe first we should just take a beat here and explain what CFIUS is. First of all, it's a horrible acronym. Like, it's not a disease, which is kind of what it sounds like. But the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States It's this intergovernmental body within the federal government that looks at foreign investments in the United States to see whether these sorts of investments can present national security risks. Like, so for example, you probably don't want like China coming in and buying the company that makes our fighter jets, right? Like, and so it's good to have a regulatory tool that can stop those transactions. Now, of course, as observers will know, CFIUS has gotten much more expansive recently. It's right in the middle of a lot of the US China fights. But that's the basic idea. It's you have a regulatory hook that can stop those particular foreign investments that actually do present genuine national security concerns.
Exactly. And it's not surprising at all that this deal would kind of go before CFIUS. So it's a big investment in a strategic sector. So, not generally surprised that is being reviewed. Also not particularly surprising that it's coming from an ally, even though kind of we typically think about CFIUS in the context of kind of Chinese investments or other sort of maybe more obvious security threats. In reality, the majority of cases that CFIUS ends up reviewing tend to be from allies, if only because those are the countries that are the biggest foreign investors in the United States. The basic contours here aren't surprising. But Emily, what has kind of sparked off the surprise here, maybe? Why is this worth talking about on our podcast?
Yeah, well, first let me just foot stomp why it's not surprising, right? I mean, if the government didn't decide to look at this deal, the parties were almost certainly going to come in and file this deal because they want that regulatory certainty, right? So the fact that CFIUS is looking at it is not weird. The fact that they're looking at an investment from an allied country is not weird. If you look at the numbers, Japan is actually, I think, number 4 in terms of number of filings before CFIUS, and some of the other big filers are, Canada, the UK. It's just the volume of investment that leads to these heightened numbers as opposed to national security concerns. But the piece that has gotten interesting in this case is kind of this melding of economic considerations and particularly labor dynamics in the context of a national security review. Now, CFIUS has very broad authority. It has a very flexible national security mandate. There's been plenty of times where it can certainly look at economic factors in the context of its national security risk assessment, looks at things like supply chains, it looks at domestic production capacity and critical technologies or materials. That's all kind of bread and butter CFIUS stuff. But it feels like this one, the economic factors are getting a little bit wonkier, right?
Yeah, I think that's right. So, so much of it is turned on questions of labor concerns and trade concerns, which typically do not come up in CFIUS review. And so, to help us better understand some of these labor and trade issues, we're really delighted to welcome Evan Robinson Johnson to the podcast. So Evan is a business reporter from the Pittsburgh Post Gazette. He's been closely following this story, specifically the steel industry generally, from on the ground in Pittsburgh. So he's got a real great perspective to help listeners kind of get inside the negotiations of what's going on here. So Evan, welcome to the show.
Thanks, guys. So good to be here.
So before we dive into the specifics of this deal, maybe give us a little bit of context here, Evan. How important is U.S. steel in the Pittsburgh community? Is there a reason why this particular transaction has struck such a nerve, particularly in your community in Pennsylvania more broadly?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two main things. One is the symbolism of a company, that has given the name of its NFL team, we're the Pittsburgh Steelers here, and colloquially known as Steel City by some folks. And then there's just the history where, this was the largest industry here for many years. Many of the kind of bedroom communities scattered around the Pittsburgh region wouldn't exist if it weren't for the steel industry. And although, the job count now is around 4,000, which is, a fraction of what it was at its peak, there's still just a close emotional tie and the very real reality that, these communities would suffer if that industry were to outright disappear.
Yeah, we certainly heard some of that sentiment come out when President Biden was talking about this particular deal, right? He called U.S. Steel an iconic American steel company, right? So there's definitely a bit of emotion coming into this review in addition to some of our dry geopolitical factors.
Absolutely. And I mean, we saw both, all three presidential candidates use steel workers as a backdrop, typically with the hard hats in the back of their rallies. And certainly the symbolism, as I mentioned, goes beyond the actual reality on the ground.
Yeah. So as you're saying, certainly kind of, the steel industry is not a stranger to political machinations, maybe we could say. Kind of, politicians get involved in the steel industry a lot. So, I think in the context of this Nippon Steel case, maybe wasn't that surprising to see that kind of it would get tied up in politics someplace. You think kind of local Pennsylvania politicians certainly would take a stake on it. I do think, again, for us, maybe a bit more outsiders to it, what was surprising was seeing these sort of statements at the very highest levels of the White House about a kind of potential CFIUS case, which generally in the context of CFIUS reviews kind of almost never happens. They kind of try and keep it as a more sort of technocratic kind of quiet process rather than the kind of high level politics. So, curious from your perspective, why do you think the White House engaged so often or so early and so publicly on this? And kind of what was the response in Pittsburgh when that kind of first White House engagement came out?
Yeah, I mean, we saw it first from Trump and then Biden and then Harris kind of down the line. And I think there was a lot of confusion here about how a president actually blocks a sale. People, didn't have a clear sense on what that meant. And then when it came out that, as you mentioned, this acronym CFIUS has some of that authority and that, it has to be based on a national security determination, people were quick to say, well, there's no national security threat here. So why is this an issue? And I mean, then we had the whole, question about this being an election year and trying to win swing state votes, particularly from union workers who had come out against the deal. But as we explained, even this week in a pretty detailed look at the CFIUS process, this is an unprecedented case for CFIUS. This is a level of engagement by their boss, the president of the United States, that they haven't had to contend with before. And while we may have seen political leanings, especially against China, actually having a president block a deal with the CFIUS recommendation remains pretty rare.
Yeah, it certainly is. And, I mean, I would agree with you that, even from the deep sea perspective, this case stood out as unusual. And a lot of that was because of the timing of the presidential statements about the deal. I mean, typically with a case like this in the CFIUS process, you've got, the very sober national security risk assessment informed by the intelligence community that kind of bubbles its way up in the system until it's ready for a presidential or cabinet level decision on what to do with the deal. But our understanding based on the reporting is that all of those statements from the president or the presidential candidates happened before they received that recommendation. And that's one of the main reasons I think why people are charging that this is unduly political. Not that CFIUS is completely free from political accountability. Of course, it's not. It's part of the federal government. It's subject to all the usual rule of law, democratic accountability mechanisms that we have. But it does seem like that timeline was part of the reason why people reacted strongly to the potential that the deal could get blocked. One thing we wanted to talk to you about, Evan, is you've been looking a lot at particularly the labor dynamics around the deal. There's certainly been some speculation that part of the reason, or a large part of the reason, that all of the presidential candidates wanted to block the deal was because they're courting union voters. And obviously, the union has very strong views on this deal, but can you tell us a little bit more about those dynamics? What does the union think about this deal, particularly in the context of what would happen without the deal, like if US Steel doesn't have this sort of investment?
I think, some of the key context for this is that steelworkers are already concerned for their jobs, particularly those who work at these dated facilities around Pittsburgh. And specifically, they've seen investment in more modern facilities that are also non-union facilities in the South. And so there's already a backdrop of concern for their jobs. There is the fundamental uncertainty with any buyer of a company in terms of, how are they going to run this? Are they going to kind of continue on the playbook of what we've seen from our current management? So it's not surprising to see, the union maybe come out against this. Some of the, initial problems that they voiced with the sale have been resolved or, seemingly resolved by the Japanese purchaser in this case, but it has not swayed the top level negotiators. And some of those negotiators also seem to have a pretty close line to President Biden, who, as I think other commentators have noted, is trying to solidify his reputation as the most pro-union president. So there is a bit of legacy that we'll see, at the end of his presidency here. with a major decision either way. And the only other shift that we're seeing here on the ground is that Nippon, the purchaser, has had a relentless campaign of trying to win over union members and convince them, whether it's through $1 billion of investment here or other promises to protect their jobs, that in fact, their ownership is the best way forward for the company.
So you mentioned that the top level negotiators, sort of at least so far, don't seem convinced by this. Curious, is there a kind of distance between the top level negotiators and some of the rank and file union members who maybe Nippon is making the kind of larger overtures towards kind of convincing them that this is the way to save their jobs?
Yeah, I mean, I think that split gets a little bit larger every day. We haven't seen any kind of formal uprising of members voicing their full opposition to senior levels of the union. But there is definitely some concern that there haven't even been meetings or negotiations between the union leaders and the purchaser. So I think that has been a source of tension. And the other flashpoint was actually the week of Labor Day when Vice President Harris was in town and promised to keep U.S. Steel American owned. It was the same week that it leaked that Biden might actually block the deal. And it was also the same week that members of the union were rallying in Pittsburgh in support of the sale. So you had this really interesting convergence of signals. And I think that has just kind of persisted even in a way that we thought it might ease up after the election. That so far has not happened.
Yeah. So one important point that we haven't brought up is that, the union does have some protections in the event of a sale, right? So they've got their basic labor agreement that gives them some voice in this process. And there's actually been an arbitration ruling on that point that basically says that Nippon Steel has fulfilled all the requirements that are required in the basic labor agreement. So what's the problem? I mean, does the union just not, I mean, the union does not agree with that, right? They've issued a statement there, but why is this at such loggerheads, right? Like, it seems like, based on the agreement that they have in place, a panel has said that the acquirer is doing everything that they should. The acquirers come out and said they're going to make all this investment. They're going to keep these plants open. Like, why is there not more of a deal space here to solve this?
Well, again, part of the issue is that they aren't meeting to make a deal happen.
Yeah, right.
I think that would go a long way. And that's been a question actually for President Biden and our governor here in Pennsylvania, both of which could potentially act as a mediator. I don't think that, that arbitration hearing was ever going to be the end of the conversation. And I don't think it was the sort of thing that resolved the fundamental concern, which is they don't want a Japanese owner. They don't want a foreign owner.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So where is Governor Shapiro on this?
Still a bit of an open question, only because most of his negotiations have happened behind the scenes. He's come out publicly and said he has the union's back. But as we talked about earlier, that's kind of a shifting dynamic these days. Mm-hmm. And the strongest signal to date is just that he wants a deal to happen. And it's pretty obvious why. That same week that I was mentioning, Labor Day week, there was a threat from U.S. Steel's management about potentially leaving the Pittsburgh area in a move that could cut thousands of jobs in the region, which obviously the governor does not want. And if there's a way to avoid that by making a deal happen, that's going to be a priority.
Okay, so certainly a key player to watch here if he feels like he needs to start being more proactive in terms of getting something done in the next 2 months, essentially.
And I think for worth pointing out that he has more leverage in these next 2 months than he will once Trump takes over.
Absolutely.
Yeah, interesting point. So maybe kind of sticking with that timing point. So obviously, we're in this period now, sort of post-election, before Trump comes in. Has sort of the politics shifted since the election? Has that kind of taken maybe a little bit of wind out of the sails of the kind of real sort of pushback against, the idea of kind of having a foreign owner come in and acquire this U.S. icon? Is there sort of more space for a deal now than there was before?
I think people expected there to be. Certainly the Japanese hoped that this would all just, evaporate after the election. certainly observers in DC hoped so, because they're not looking for a major precedent-setting decision here. And I think it also just raised questions about, with the shift in administration, how does President Biden actually want to end his administration? But I don't think that we have a cool down period at all, or a deal space, as Emily's hoping for. And I think that like the debate in some ways has ratcheted up, because you've got this kind of key decision before Trump takes over.
So one thing that we certainly have seen coming out of Nippon Steel, in addition to this like retail political campaign that they're doing across Pennsylvania, which, seems like they're like handing out like campaign stickers and eating cookies and stuff, which is very interesting, right? Just in terms of the tactical approach there.
Yes.
But there's also a harder line approach that they've clearly signaled, including statements from some of their executive team, that they're willing to sue about this, right? Like to bring litigation in the event that the deal gets blocked. Do you think that's a real threat?
Well, yes, I do, because even though any expert you talk to will say that that's not a winning strategy, they also have this unprecedented historical case of intervention, potentially before a CFIUS decision. So, I think it's important to note. People ask all the time, like, why have they not just walked away from this deal? When I met with the vice chairman of Nippon, who is sort of tasked with bringing this deal to the finish line, he described it as like a generational opportunity to get into the steel market here. And we're seeing a change in administration where there is concern about tariffs. I think there's a need for them, as they expand globally, to be selling to the domestic American market. And I think we saw, even in their promise this week not to import into the U.S., a pretty clear signal that this market matters to them, and they're not going to walk away without a fight.
All right, Evan, if you're a betting man, how does this all turn out?
I got to think that when, Biden is spending time in the Amazon rainforest and, sort of finishing up shop, he doesn't necessarily want to send a lasting, devastating signal on foreign investment. But like you said, it's an open question.
Okay, well, Evan, thank you so much for joining us. This has been a great discussion.
Thank you. Great talking to you.
So we just had a great discussion with Evan Robinson Johnson of the Pittsburgh Post Gazette. And, he closed, one of the things he talked about was that Governor Shapiro is quite interested in kind of getting a deal across the finish line here. So kind of curious, Emily, do you think that's a realistic path forward? Like, what would that deal look like?
So I absolutely think there is a deal space here, right? I mean, I think the companies have been very proactive in trying to put forward things that would, appeal to the union, right? They've promised these investments. They've promised to keep the plant open. There's probably additional stuff that they could do in terms of, management of the U.S. facilities, making sure that labor continues to have a strong role, making sure that, there is that real U.S. ownership aspect. I thought that was really interesting what everyone was talking about in terms of, kind of the emotional, almost nostalgic nature of this business. And,
Keep the football team named the Steelers.
That's
we
right.
Don't need to change that.
That's right. This is America, after all. But I think there's a question about part of the problem with this deal seems to be that there's such bad blood between the union and the companies, and it's just really hard for them to trust the companies.
Yeah.
And I actually think that's where CFIUS can come in and play a useful role here to actually help put in place some terms that are not just terms agreed to by the parties, but actually are agreements with the government.
Yep.
And are legally binding, they're enforceable, and it just provides this additional layer of assurance that the parties are going to do what they say they're going to do.
Yeah, and a real backstop to make sure they follow through on it. And, it's interesting, there's a sort of analogous case that's out there, which has been going on at the same time, and that's Cleveland-Cliffs, the U.S. steel company, acquiring a Canadian company, Steelco Holdings. And so this went through the Canadian sort of CFIUS-like process, their foreign investment review process, and just a few weeks ago announced that that was approved, but again, with a number of kind of commitments, requirements on the deal. So they are going to keep the historic brand and keep some of the emotional connections that Steelco has in Canada. Also, commitments to honor collective bargaining agreements, commitments to invest in R&D, a number of commitments around greenhouse gas emissions, which may or may not be relevant for U.S. policy, but seems relevant at least for Canadian policy interest. So, we have kind of the outlines of what a deal could look like here, and the kind of additional benefit you get from doing this through a foreign investment review process, where it's not just the two companies talking to each other, but you have the outside mediator to enforce some of these things.
Yeah, and I think it's important also to note that the parties are highly incentivized to get to a deal here, right? I mean, Evan talked about how Nippon is looking at this as kind of a generational investment, but there's also kind of a more legalistic reason why they are incentivized, which is we understand that in the contract between the parties, there's what's called this hell or high water clause. Basically, they have to do whatever CFIUS says in order to clear the deal, right? So the government has a ton of leverage here, and I think the question is, how do they responsibly use that leverage to get to a landing zone on this deal if they want to? And so part of that's going to be, how do they kind of craft a reasonable assessment of a national security risk arising from the transaction and then match mitigation terms to that. That's kind of the basic CFIUS formula, right? You can't just make anything up to clear a deal, right? Like, that is not within the CFIUS legal framework. But, I think there's enough there with steel as like a strategic material and domestic production being something that CFIUS has always looked at in the course of its risk assessments, that there's enough there that you could pass the sniff test on getting to some level of risk, but then using mitigation to resolve that risk and allow for clearance of the deal.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, you could imagine what would go into that mitigation agreement, things on, potentially production requirements, things on union contracts, on, keeping plants open, whatever else it may be. I guess the one hiccup here, which is that there's been some reporting that kind of, one of the things that CFIUS seems to be worried about in their risk review here is the role of U.S. Steel in trade remedies cases.
Yeah, this is weird.
This is so very weird. We're going to try and spare listeners a kind of 20-minute overview of how trade remedy law works in the United States.
Do you not think that would be of interest?
We could go deep if we want to. But, the short version is that U.S. Steel historically has been very involved in challenging kind of foreign steel that's being imported into the United States, and that they have worked very closely with the U.S. government, with the Commerce Department, to put together trade cases challenging cheap imports of steel. And there seems to be a worry that if Nippon was now owning the company, they would no longer be as committed to their historic role in trade remedies. At least that's what I understand to be the concern, but I'm not sure I really get all of it.
Well, and part of it is that Nippon has been accused of dumping cheap steel into the U.S., and that's hurt U.S. steel production, right? And I think there was even a recent commerce investigation released coincidentally that alleges that there is this continued practice of dumping, right? So that's clearly part of the underlying context here. The question is, does any of that matter for a national security risk assessment? And I think it is a stretch, right? I think it's a stretch to say that these sort of trade issues, broadly speaking, are either a national security risk or a national security risk that can't be resolved, and therefore the deal has to be blocked. But the other reason this one is just so weird is if you think about the rest of what's happening in U.S. trade policy right now, the government no longer relies on companies to do petitions. The government's doing tariffs. The government's doing whatever it wants to push back on these practices. So the fact that the companies may not do it as much, if that's even a plausible argument, just seems like totally out of step with like the rest of U.S. trade policy at this point.
Yeah, exactly. If the U.S. government is worried that U.S. Steel will not play the leading role in, taking an aggressive view towards steel imports, like, there are lots of other tools the U.S. government has at its disposal, and it has used in recent years to be very clear where it thinks about, incoming cheap steel. So it's hard to see exactly how that plays out, but I do think, that's the question was out there, was sort of like, what would a mitigation on that look like? And it's hard to just kind of conceptually figure out, a commitment to join future trade remedy cases, I guess. But like hypothetically, who knows what those would be?
I think it's actually like a commitment to keep the foreign acquirer entirely out of decisions.
That's true.
On that matter, to provide some insulation to kind of the U.S. managers of these businesses to make those decisions independently and autonomously. But again, like it's just weird. I don't know how to explain that one. Okay, so We do think there's space for a deal to be had here. CFIUS can play a helpful role in providing some additional teeth and kind of helping the companies and the union get over some of the bad blood here. But that's maybe an optimistic scenario. There's still a very real possibility that either President Biden or President-elect Trump, when he is in office, just blocks the deal. So what happens if the deal gets blocked?
So certainly what Nippon Steel's lawyers will tell you, they're kind of going around telling everyone in town this, I think, is that they will challenge this in court. That, they think it seems relatively clear this would be sort of CFIUS overstepping its bounds. As our discussion with Evian sort of a minute ago made clear, this is really an unprecedented case. There's sort of not lots of examples of CFIUS taking this type of action in this very politicized process. So Nippon is saying that, if it is blocked, they intend to go to litigation.
Yeah, and I think, worth just reiterating the timeline of some of the presidential statements here, because I do think that's going to be central to any litigation, right? So you have a president who is in charge of the CFIUS process in the context of a political campaign event stating opposition to this transaction before he is reported to have received the actual risk assessment, right? That is the crux of it. That's what makes it seem like this is undue political influence and what's supposed to be, kind of a, not independent, because CFIUS is not independent of the president, but it's supposed to be more of a kind of a technical risk assessment process that leads to these decisions. And so that actually seems straightforward, except it's not when you actually look at what the legal claims would be in litigation. And first, we should point out, neither of us are lawyers.
Good caveat, important to know.
This is not legal advice. But it's worth just unpacking a little bit of what the legal claims would be and why it actually would be a really hard case for the companies to successfully litigate.
Yeah, so maybe the closest example here that we have is the Rawls case. So Emily, can you walk us through a little bit sort of how that played out and what that may suggest about possible litigation here?
Yeah, so there's not been a ton of litigation in the CFIUS case, but before I even get to that, it's worth stating up front that the CFIUS statute, so the Defense Production Act, which is the behemoth defense bill that includes the legal authorities for CFIUS, actually includes a bar on judicial review of any of the actions or findings that the president takes under these authorities. So basically, the law says that the courts can't second guess presidential decisions on these sort of CFIUS matters. And that's pretty clear. Now, the Rawls case that you mentioned is interesting because it's one of the few cases where CFIUS or presidential actions have been litigated. So the background on that, it was 2012. There was a company called Rawls, which is a Chinese-owned company that was buying a couple of sites of land to build wind farms. The problem with that was that these land sites just happened to be near or within restricted airspace and bombing zones of the U.S. Navy. And for those of you who aren't familiar with restricted airspace, et cetera, basically out west, there's just huge swaths of land where the land may be privately owned, but the airspace above it is restricted because that is where the Navy or the Air Force is just doing tons of training exercises, right? So obviously sensitive. It's a thing that CFIUS has always been concerned about. And no, you don't really want, a Chinese company coming in and building large structures in the middle of that.
Yeah, the national security risk there is pretty clear.
Pretty clear, right? Nonetheless, the companies decided to litigate on that. And it went through a couple of steps in the legal process. But basically, what we care about from that case is two things. One, the courts confirmed the bar on judicial review. And it was pretty clear cut. They basically said that they don't have jurisdiction to second guess the president's actions or findings because of the bar on judicial review in the Defense Production Act, right? So pretty clear cut. Courts don't have a role there. What they did find is that the courts still have an ability to look at constitutional claims, right? So that kind of trumps any sort of Defense Production Act, bar on courts taking a look at things. And the constitutional claim that came up in that context was related to due process. Basically, Rawls had come in, they had bought these land parcels, the transaction was completed, therefore they had a vested property right, and the government could not deprive them of that property right without due process. And so the big decision that came out was that the government, even in the context of CFIUS, has to provide that due process as a constitutional matter.
Great. So we have this due process issue. How does that connect to the Nippon case?
Yeah, so a couple things we can take away from the Rawls decision, right? First, it doesn't seem like the courts would view that they have jurisdiction to look at the president's action if he decides to block the deal, right?
The president says that Steel is a national security issue, then Steel is a national security issue. And
there you go. Yeah, that's the deal with Steel. The more interesting question, I think, is around due process. Because, like, just, from a common sense layperson's perspective, like, this doesn't seem like a great process. Like, it doesn't seem like it worked the way that it did. But here, again, it's not clear cut because this transaction that we're talking about, the U.S. Steel transaction, is a pending transaction. They haven't actually bought it yet. So there's not that vested property right that might cause those due process claims to kick in. So, it's an untested legal case, I think. Maybe the parties would prevail just, again, because that timeline with the presidential statements coming before the risk assessment, that does look a little, I don't know, it doesn't look great. But I think, if I were a lawyer, which, again, I am not a lawyer, but, like, I do think that this would be a hard case to prevail on in the courts.
I think that's right. Like, it seems hard to go up against CFIUS in the courts. Having said that, I think it's also pretty clear that CFIUS does not want this in court.
Right, yeah.
CFIUS is, quite litigation averse, we could say. I think, that Rawls case, the reason it's still talked about 10 years later is that it did send some kind of spooks through the system of like, oh, maybe there are actually some bounds on what we can do here. Again, even with the sort of quite expansive decision on judicial review, the sort of due process issues does make CFIUS think, we need to be careful here. And again, given how broad a remit CFIUS often has in these things, they want to be very clear that their decisions are final. Not everyone is going to go up to court and have to sort of fight this time and time again. And maybe now is when we should bring in the other kind of looming case here, which is TikTok.
Oh, an excuse to talk about TikTok. Oh,
hard to believe TikTok's coming up again. But TikTok, amidst its sort of many other legal travails in the United States here, there's a sort of ongoing pending litigation case where TikTok challenged, again, an initial kind of quick CFIUS decision on it back in the first Trump administration. And that has been sort of caught up in legal review, kind of sort of stalled legal review for quite some time now. But I think what we've really seen here is the government is worried about, the potential of growing kind of case history on how are we bounding CFIUS's authorities.
I think that's right. I mean, I think the most we don't need to go through the legal claims in the TikTok case because they are a bit different. I mean, they're also talking about due process, but for a different set of facts and circumstances that don't apply here. But I think the interesting point, as you note, is that part of the reason why we've had all of these other legislative efforts to try to ban TikTok is you can kind of intuit that the government didn't want to push the boundaries in the context of the CFIUS litigation. So they were trying to find another legal avenue. And so if that's the lesson you draw from the TikTok case, then maybe your legal strategy does become like, well, let's threaten litigation because we know that the government doesn't want litigation. And maybe that's actually what brings them to the bargaining table to try to land a deal here.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, from Nippon's point of view, there's probably not much downside to the litigation. So
except that they might have to actually carry out litigation.
Well, that too. Yeah.
Other than that. Okay. So that's the litigation risk. I think there's still a decent chance that we end up there. I think it's also worth noting that I am not sure that a Trump administration is adverse to litigation risk as a Biden team is, but we'll see how this one all plays out. But there's also some bigger picture questions here, right? So step away from the kind of technical legal issues, step away from kind of the specific issues with the steel sector. There's a broader conversation about potential politicization of the CFIUS process, right? That is why this case has really struck a nerve here. And it's not the first time that this has come up in the CFIUS context. How do we think about, on the one hand, political accountability in the CFIUS process, right? Like these are quite literally big deals, and you want to make sure that the right people in government have visibility, are able to shepherd these deals in a way that's appropriate and consistent with their policy goals. How do you differentiate that sort of political accountability with like the undue political influence that seems to be at issue in the Nippon Steel case?
Yeah, huge questions. And again, usual caveat, not a lawyer, I'll say I am a political scientist, so I have my own biases on the table here. Maybe just be clear, like, I always think this is, there's an idea amongst lawyers that we can kind of depoliticize a lot of these issues and questions that I'm just sort of, as a political scientist, very skeptical of. That I think look across the world, across history, foreign investment is always very politicized. From, kind of mines being expropriated in Latin America. I mean, there's sort of countless examples you can look at that these sort of politics of foreign investment are so often charged and run very deep, and the ability to put in technocratic and legal processes to take the politics out of that, I think, has real limits. So I think that's the kind of challenge that CFIUS is grappling with, is that they want to kind of take this politics out as much as possible, but at the end of the day, the politics are still there.
And so this is not the first time that CFIUS has grappled with this, right? I mean, so there was a big political flare-up, even before TikTok, right? If you go back to the aughts around Dubai ports and the proposed acquisition of some critical port infrastructure by this UAE company, right, in the kind of post 9/11 era. So what was that political firestorm about?
Yeah, I mean, this is the case that's in some ways, in my mind, the most similar to what we're seeing now on Nippon Steel, although in some funny ways it's the kind of reverse of how this was actually played out. So again, the context here, sort of late 2005, Dubai Ports World is sort of trying to acquire a sort of series of U.S. port operations. Politically charged, sort of, again, kind of post 9/11 moment. Dubai Ports World, I think, recognizes this is going to be a kind of complicated political question. They sort of do the right thing, as it were, and kind of go to CFIUS and get CFIUS approval. So it goes through the entire sort of technocratic CFIUS process. CFIUS signs off and says, yes, we approve of this. The sort of, press releases and news stories start coming out that a Middle Eastern company is buying a whole bunch of ports, and suddenly it's a political firestorm. And so you've got Chuck Schumer in the Senate kind of, holding press conferences saying kind of, we can't allow this sale to go through. You ultimately have kind of real legislation that's passing through kind of both chambers of Congress saying, we're going to intervene and kind of overrule the CFIUS decision here. Meanwhile, George W. Bush, president at the time, saying, I'm going to veto that legislation if it comes to my desk. So kind of, deeply politicized. And I don't know if we ever kind of figured out the answer of what would happen if Congress tried to say we're overruling CFIUS. For better or worse, we never got that far. But ultimately what happens is that in the face of this sort of massive political backlash, Dubai Ports World says, all right, we need to bow out. We're just sort of not going to do this, even though it had already technically been approved by CFIUS. They decide in early 2006 that the kind of politics are just too hard for them to operate there. And I think what it really shows is that, ideally the reason you want the CFIUS process, you want to, again, kind of take some of the politics out of it and do it technocratically, but you need to balance it with the political accountability and legitimacy. And again, I think, it's an open discussion about whether sort of Chuck Schumer's concerns here were valid or not, but it is a sort of fact of the world that the CFIUS decision to approve this case did not have political legitimacy in our political institutions. And ultimately, despite the kind of technocratic approval, the deal didn't happen because Dubai Ports World kind of couldn't fight that uphill battle against the politics, even when it had the legal backing to do so.
And that's what led to a series of CFIUS reforms in that era as well, where they're trying to recalibrate this balance of mostly having a bottom-up, technocratically led process, but putting in some approval processes, some review requirements to make sure that political appointees who are accountable to the president, ultimately accountable to the American people, that there's that right balance in there. And so I think it's a fair question to ask, like, are we at another inflection point now with Nippon Steel, where we need to think about those sorts of reforms and updates again? Like, are we in another time in this journey where we just need to recalibrate? Like, how does this all work? What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think there's this history of the back and forth between more political and more legal approaches towards dealing with foreign investment. And exactly as you say, that you get these political blowups now and then that often spur reforms, either sort of legislative or otherwise, in the CFIUS process. So I do think, however Nippon ends up being settled, there will be questions going forward of, like, if this happened again, what would a good outcome here look like, right? And I think there's a question that, there's a sense that CFIUS is sort of moving beyond the types of concerns it normally deals with, but also that, maybe some of the labor concerns aren't out of bounds, that sort of, it makes sense that the U.S. government should have, a take on, well, what does this mean for labor unions, and what are the instruments we'd want to have to intervene in that?
Yeah, so I have some ideas. This
Great.
is a long prologue, so I could tell you how I think we should reform the process. So I think there's like a really obvious no-brainer thing that CFIUS should do, which is to issue guidance on how it considers economic factors, including labor union input, in the context of its national security risk assessments. As we said before, like there is a history of CFIUS looking at economic-related things, like supply chains, like domestic production of key materials, but there's not a lot of visibility outside of that very closed CFIUS process, because CFIUS doesn't actually talk a lot about its decision-making process. It's really hard to know externally how are they actually baking economics into national security, right? And like as we're in this broader context where economic security is a thing, there's apparently some podcasts on it, it's blending with national security, like these lines are getting really, really blurred, and I think it's getting harder to understand if there's a distinction, where that distinction is, where you're drawing the line. So I think like a no-brainer thing would be issue some guidance. Yep. Now, the Biden administration did issue an EO that provided some guidance on the sort of national security factors that it's currently looking at, but I don't think it went far enough. Like it was good, right? It's a good effort at transparency, but I think they need like a whole separate kind of set of guidance that's specifically on this question.
Yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense. And certainly coming out of this particular case, it would, if we end up with a mitigation agreement that details these are the type of things that we are concerned about, that would probably be a good starting point to say, here are the concerns that we might put into sort of more public guidance on it. Just to come back, I 100% agree. We need more, transparency and sort of insight into how CFIUS actually works and how it thinks about these things. I always joke that almost every news article about CFIUS starts by describing it as a secretive government agency or the little known agency. And kind of, CFIUS just needs to come out of the shadows a little bit. And frankly, I know they're not comfortable with that all the time, but there's a real need, not only for the companies that are going up in front of CFIUS to understand kind of what the decision-making process is, but, more broadly for the public, so we don't have these Dubai Ports World examples again, where sort of CFIUS wants to come in and say, yes, we looked at these risks and, trust us, they're fine. If that does not actually sway the public, it's not serving its job.
So guidance is kind of the easy answer to this, but there's some harder, probably more controversial things that CFIUS could consider, or Congress could consider on behalf of CFIUS and put into legislation, right? So what do some of those look like?
So again, I think, on transparency, you could get into releasing more info on specific cases. So CFIUS traditionally has been very reluctant, not just reluctant, kind of legally prohibited from sharing information in terms of who has, applied for CFIUS approval and what cases they're looking at. So, CFIUS every year will put out a kind of annual report on their statistics, but it's very high-level aggregated data, and you don't really get a sense of like, all right, what are the actual cases they're looking in, kind of, more details of the sectors, more details of kind of, what did they consider making these decisions. I do think there's scope, beyond just guidance to release some actual information here. That would be very useful.
Yeah, I agree with that. And there's an interesting counter example here, which is the team telecom process. So there's like a separate interagency process. It's like all the same agencies, just in a different meeting room, where they look at, things like landing licenses for submarine cables and like kind of telecommunications infrastructure and foreign involvement in our U.S. telecommunications infrastructure. That's a process that's run in support of FCC licensing requirements, but the interesting bit of it is that it's all done on a public docket, so that when there's a mitigation agreement that's signed, it's actually public, right? So like we can do this. In fact, we do this in other contexts. And so, I'm sure there's downsides here, and you need to think about, how this would change the CFIUS process, but I think there's space here to do something.
Yeah, I think so as well. And again, some of the downside, obviously there's a national security kind of protect sources and methods information collection issue, which obviously makes sense. A lot of the historical pushback to transparency CFIUS, some of it has come from the private sector of, companies that are worried about sort of market moving information. Kind of these are often proposed acquisitions that have not yet gone through. But again, I think there are paths forward where we think about, information released on a delay, or you could sort of, put out some information while still holding back names of companies. There's sort of middle grounds here that will be practical ways forward.
Yeah. Also, it's important to just be realistic about the fact that on these controversial cases, the parties always leak the mitigation agreement anyways. And so the government is just fundamentally at a communications disadvantage because you have one side that's out there talking to the press, and then reporters are reporting based on that one side of the story, which might be it is completely biased, right? Yes. And so I do think the government should think about that aspect as well, particularly as CFIUS continues to play such an important role. So there's some other stuff we could think about too, though. So we've been talking about the fact that the courts can't review CFIUS cases. And so should we just let everybody litigate? Does that seem like a good idea?
I don't know if a swarm of litigation is what we need. But I do think this question of, to put it provocatively, sort of, should CFIUS operate kind of above the law, right? Which, maybe not. Maybe there should be some more guardrails. Maybe there should be more kind of checks here, that judicial review should be expanded beyond just a kind of due process constitutional claims point of view. How exactly would that work? I think there's questions. I don't think, again, you want the CFIUS process to be relatively final, so you do not want, a judge to kind of sit through and make national security decisions that they're probably not too steeped in, and sort of, reassess every national security decision that the government is making here. But there might be areas where we can loosen up a little bit.
Yeah, it's a good point. I don't think CFIUS is operating above the law, but I think it's a question of if the executive is tempted to stretch the boundaries of the law.
And that's a more fair way of putting it.
Yeah, okay, great. Okay, the last thing I think we wanted to talk about here is the question of whether the national security test should be amended, right? So there's, we've talked about, providing more guidance and, being more clear about the economic considerations, but there's a totally different approach that some countries use to screening foreign investment.
Yeah, so if you look at countries like Canada and Australia, they have what they talk as a national interest test, which is really a much broader way to say, is accepting this foreign investment in the broadest sense of the country's national interest or not? So that you can see much easier to bring in labor concerns, other economic concerns, sort of environmental concerns, what have you. You wouldn't need to sort of stretch the definition of national security to get at all these things. You could fit them into a broader national interest.
Yeah, of course, downsides to that approach too, right? If you look at, for example, in the Australian system, a few years back, there was a Chinese investment in the port of Darwin at the same time that the Marines were putting a whole bunch of new Marines in the port of Darwin, right? And so as you think about, if we're going to go down that path, are you balancing security interest and economic interest, or does one always trump the other? I think there's a lot of really hard questions that you would have to think through. But when I think about this, I don't know if that's the right idea, but I think if we're going to start really using these sort of national security processes, including CFIUS, for economic reasons, we shouldn't just shove that into a national security process and call everything national security. Yeah. That's not good for these institutions. If we're going to actually be doing national interest stuff, we should have a transparent process about how to build the guardrails, how to build guidance, how to actually do that in a way that's legitimate and has a lot of public input and buy-in, and not just pretend like everything is national security.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Again, I think the broader historical context here is the focus on national security comes out of a policy stance where the U.S. government wanted to be as open as possible to foreign investment while kind of walling off just a very narrow piece of the economy for national security reasons. I don't know that that's where we're at anymore. It seems like we are sort of more open to thinking through government intervention in the economy for a wider range of reasons, for taking a more skeptical view towards foreign investments, and that, again, whatever you think on the merits of that as a sort of policy stance or not, if that is where the government is, we should have the institutional tools to carry that out.
I think that's right. You just don't want the pendulum to swing too far in the other direction. Yeah. Okay, so that was a lot of nerdy, legal, institutional stuff. Where do you think this particular case, the Nippon Steel case, goes? If you were a betting man, Geoff, how do you think this one ends?
Oof. Hard to say.
No, I actually think that's right. It's just woof.
So look, I think it's interesting. So the Nippon Steel bid, the acquisition price was $55 a share. I kind of looked earlier today. U.S. Steel is currently trading for about $38 a share. So we said, not legal advice. It's also not financial advice. But it appears that the markets still have a lot of skepticism that this is actually going to close at a $55 a share price. The politics of it, I mean, what does Biden want in his final kind of weeks, months here? I think, he's obviously put a big push on being a pro-union president. I think there's an interesting question, as Evan was talking about, some of the splits between union leadership and some of the rank and file workers on what actually is the kind of pro-union position here. Mm-hmm. And if you come to an outcome, again, we sort of talked about Nippon Steel sort of maximalist negotiating tactics. I think, U.S. Steel is talking about like, oh, if we don't get this Nippon Steel investment, are we going to have to close the mill and stuff like that? And certainly that's not something that Biden wants on his watch. At the same time, we know they've been talking very closely with the Japanese on a whole range of economic security issues. I do not think Biden wants to, take a real shot across the bow at Japan as a close ally on so many things that they are trying to do on his way out the door. So I'm not sure. Again, if I were a betting man, I think the most likely answer is they kind of punt it to the next administration. So some type of, get Nippon to refile and the deadline gets moved past December. But we'll see.
I'm going to take the opposite side of that bet. I am not a betting man, but I would say I think that because this issue touches President Biden on some issues that are so personal to him and his legacy, I would bet that he wants to resolve this on his own terms, right? Like you talk about the alliance building, that's something he has spent a ton of time working on, particularly with Japan. And again, like how does he view this fitting into his legacy, right? Like I don't know, if I were him, obviously he has a lot to do in the next 2 months and there's a lot of legacy stuff that he's thinking about and working on, but I would have to imagine that he wants to land this one on his own terms. But we'll see.
No, that makes sense. And again, I think if you can come up with a deal that the USW is going to come out and say is a win, then that probably is a sort of mitigation agreement that the USW signs off on. That could look like a big sort of legacy-defining moment for him.
All right, well, we'll keep an eye on it.
Great. Thanks, Emily.
Thanks, Geoff. Thanks for listening to De-Risky Business, an economic security podcast from the Energy, Economics, and Security Program at the Center for a New American Security. Have any questions or comments? Get in touch at deriskybusiness@cnas.org. The nerdier, the better. And find us wherever you get your podcasts every other Thursday.